Chapter 1. The spark of an idea. Hank Carlson had always believed that math was misunderstood. People treated it like a monster lurking in the shadows, ready to pounce with fractions and formulas. But Hank saw math differently, like a puzzle waiting to be solved, a language that whispered secrets about the world. And every day, in his bright, slightly cluttered classroom at Willow Creek Elementary, he tried to convince his students of the same. "Okay, team," Hank said, tapping the whiteboard with his marker. "If you can figure out how many tomatoes I need to make salsa for the entire class, you win bragging rights for the day." The kids perked up. Math problems were one thing, but math problems involving food, that was Hank's specialty. He loved weaving real-world examples into lessons, recipes, gardening, even the occasional sports stat. Anything to make numbers feel less intimidating. A hand shot up. "Mr. Carlson, do we get to eat the salsa?" Hank grinned. "If you solve the problem before lunch, you bet." The room buzzed with chatter as pencils scratched against paper. Hank leaned against his desk, watching the gears turn in their young minds. That moment, the spark when confusion melted into understanding, was why he loved teaching. It was worth every late night spent planning lessons and every weekend grading papers. When the bell rang, Hank gathered his things and headed toward the greenhouse. It wasn't part of his job description, but volunteering there was his favorite way to unwind. Rows of leafy greens and herbs thrived under the glass roof, their earthy scent calming him after a day of fractions and decimals. He checked the basil first, his pride and joy, then watered the tomatoes, humming softly to himself. The school was good. Dedicated teachers, curious kids, a sense of community that felt like family. But it wasn't perfect. Funding was tight, and extras like after-school programs were always the first to go. Hank hated seeing kids miss out on opportunities just because the budget couldn't stretch far enough. As he trimmed a stubborn vine, a memory surfaced, bright and warm, like sunlight through the glass. When Hank was a kid, his school held quarterly festivals. Each classroom transformed into a carnival booth, complete with games and prizes. Families bought tickets, laughter filled the halls, and for one magical evening, school felt like a fairground. It wasn't just fun, it brought the community together. What if? The idea bloomed like the basil under his care. A festival could raise money for programs, sure, but it could also teach real-world skills. Budgeting, teamwork, healthy competition. Kids could design games, calculate costs, manage tickets. Math in action. And maybe, just maybe, the community would rally behind it. By the time Hank locked up the greenhouse, his mind was buzzing with possibilities. He spent the evening hunched over his laptop, crafting a short presentation. Charts, bullet points, even a mock-up of a math maze booth. He wanted the principal to see the potential not just for fun, but for education. The next morning, Hank walked into Principal Harris's office with a mix of nerves and excitement. Harris was a tall man with a calm demeanor and a knack for raising one eyebrow in silent judgment. Hank hoped today wouldn't involve that eyebrow. "I've got an idea," Hank began, setting his laptop on the desk. "What if we bring back the school festival? Each class runs a game booth, families buy tickets, and the funds go toward after-school programs." Harris leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Interesting, but classroom time is precious. How do we justify it?" Hank clicked to the next slide. "By making it educational. Students handle budgets, design games, calculate probabilities. It's math, science, even art, all rolled into one." The eyebrow stayed down. "Good sign." And, Hank added, "it strengthens community ties. Parents get involved, local businesses can sponsor prizes. It's a win-win." Harris studied the screen, then nodded slowly. "I like it. Let me bring it up at the next board meeting." Hank left the office with a grin that lasted all day. For the first time in weeks, he felt like something big was about to happen. Something good. Chapter 2. The unexpected ally. Hank Carlson had never considered himself a nervous man, but standing in the teacher's lounge with a cup of lukewarm coffee and a folder labeled Festival Proposal, he felt his pulse tick up a notch. Principal Harris had emailed him that morning. The board approved the trial run. Start planning. Just like that, Hank's idea had gone from a hopeful pitch to a full-fledged responsibility. He stared at the folder as if it might sprout legs and walk away. "Okay," he muttered under his breath. "You wanted this, Hank. Time to make it happen." The lounge door swung open, and in breezed Lila Bennett, the art teacher. Hank knew her in the way teachers know each other, passing in hallways, exchanging polite smiles during staff meetings. She was hard to miss, though. Bright scarves, paint-stained fingertips, and an energy that seemed to hum like a live wire. Today, her scarf was a swirl of turquoise and gold, and her hair was piled into a messy bun that somehow looked intentional. "Morning," she chirped, heading straight for the coffee pot. "Please tell me this sludge is at least caffeinated." Hank chuckled. "Barely. It's more of a suggestion than an actual beverage." She grinned, pouring herself a cup. "Good enough. So what's with the serious face? You look like someone told you recess was canceled." Hank hesitated, then held up the folder. "Festival planning." The board gave the green light. Lila's eyes lit up. "Oh, that's your idea? I heard whispers about it." Carnival games, community involvement, very retro. I love it. Thanks, Hank said, feeling a flicker of pride. Now I just have to figure out how to pull it off without losing my mind. Lila took a sip of coffee, then tilted her head. Need help? The question caught him off guard. You want to help? Of course. She set her cup down with a decisive clink. I've been dying for something fun to break up the monotony of grading sketchbooks and explaining why glitter is not a food group. Plus, I'm great at making things look exciting. You handle the mathy stuff, I'll handle the artsy chaos. Hank blinked. He'd expected to shoulder this alone, maybe rope in a few reluctant volunteers. But Lila? She was volunteering without hesitation, and smiling about it. That would be amazing, he admitted. I was worried no one would want to take this on. Are you kidding? This is the most exciting thing to happen since the vending machine started carrying trail mix. She grabbed a napkin and a pen from the counter. Okay, tell me everything. Hank laughed, the tension in his shoulders easing. Well, the idea is simple. Each class creates a game booth. Families buy tickets, play games, win prizes. The money goes toward after-school programs. Love it, Lila said, scribbling on the napkin like a woman possessed. We need themes, color schemes, maybe a mascot? Ooh, what about a giant inflatable pencil? Hank raised an eyebrow. That sounds terrifying. Fine, a friendly pencil, she amended, sketching a smiling cartoon pencil with jazz hands. See? Adorable. Hank shook his head, amused. You're really into this. Of course I am. This is what school should feel like. Fun, creative, a little chaotic. She tapped the napkin. So when do we start? Soon, Hank said. We'll need to meet with the other teachers, assign booths, figure out logistics. Perfect. I'll make a mood board. A mood board. Trust me, she said with a wink. You'll thank me later. By the end of the day, Hank had a partner, and a growing sense that this festival might actually work. Lila's enthusiasm was contagious, and her ideas, while occasionally wild, had a spark that made Hank's practical brain hum with possibilities. They met again after school in the greenhouse, because Hank had promised to water the herbs and Lila insisted she needed creative oxygen. She wandered between rows of basil and mint, trailing her fingers over leaves like they were works of art. This place is magical, she said, inhaling deeply. You grow all this yourself? Mostly, Hank replied, adjusting the watering can. It's my therapy. I get that, Lila said softly. For me, it's painting. When the world feels loud, I just make something. Hank glanced at her, surprised by the sudden quiet in her voice. For a moment, the playful energy dimmed, revealing something deeper. Then she smiled again, bright and easy. So, she said, hopping onto the edge of a planting table. Tell me your vision for this festival. Hank launched into his plan: budget sheets, ticket pricing, educational tie-ins. Lila listened, nodding, occasionally interrupting with bursts of creativity. What if the math maze had glow-in-the-dark paint? Can we make the ticket booth look like a castle? Do you think the principal would let us have a dunk tank? Hank laughed. You're going to get me fired. Please. Harris loves me. I once convinced him to let the 5th graders paint a mural in the hallway. That explains the giant dragon by the library. Exactly. I'm a miracle worker. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light through the glass, Hank realized he was enjoying himself. Really enjoying himself. Planning didn't feel like a chore with Lila around. Felt fun. And maybe, just maybe, a little dangerous. Because every time she laughed, something in his chest shifted, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. When they finally packed up, Lila grabbed her bag and flashed him a grin. Same time tomorrow? Hank hesitated, then smiled back. Yeah, same time. As she walked away, scarf fluttering like a banner, Hank stood among the rows of green and thought, what just happened? Chapter 3, Plans and Banter. By Thursday afternoon, Hank's classroom looked less like a temple of mathematics and more like a war room. Papers were spread across his desk, budget sheets, ticket mock-ups, a list of potential game ideas. He'd even drawn a rough sketch of a math maze, though his artistic skills left the maze looking suspiciously like a lopsided pretzel. He was mid-scribble when the door swung open without warning. Knock, knock, Lila sang, stepping inside with a tote bag slung over her shoulder. I brought reinforcements. Hank looked up, startled. Reinforcements? She plopped the tote onto his desk and began pulling out supplies like a magician revealing tricks. Colored markers, poster boards, a stack of sticky notes shaped like stars. If we're planning a festival, we need visuals, charts, color coding, maybe a little sparkle. Hank eyed the glitter jar she set down. That looks dangerous. Dangerous is where the magic happens, Lila said, grinning. Now scoot over. We're making this fun. Hank chuckled, sliding his chair aside as Lila commandeered half his desk. She spread out the poster boards and uncapped a marker with a flourish. So, she said, sketching a bold title across the top of the first board, Festival Master Plan. What's our timeline? 3 weeks, Hank replied. The board wants results fast. 3 weeks. Lila whistled. That's practically tomorrow in teacher time. Tell me about it, Hank muttered, flipping through his notes. We'll need to meet with the other teachers. Assign booths, figure out ticket pricing. Done, Lila interrupted, jotting down bullet points in bright purple ink. We'll hold a staff meeting tomorrow. I'll make a slideshow. Hank blinked. You're making a slideshow? Of course, with transitions, maybe even sound effects. Sound effects. Don't underestimate the power of a dramatic whoosh. Hank, he laughed, shaking his head. You're something else. I'll take that as a compliment, she said, flashing him a smile that made his stomach do an odd little flip. For the next hour, they worked side by side, bouncing ideas back and forth. Hank's suggestions were practical ticket bundles, prize budgets, booth layouts. Lila's were less practical but undeniably fun. What if we have a photo booth with props? She suggested, doodling a pair of oversized sunglasses on the corner of the board. Props cost money, Hank pointed out. Not if we make them ourselves, Lila countered. Cardboard, paint, a little elbow grease. Boom. Instant fun. Hank considered it. Okay, that's doable. See? You're learning to embrace chaos. I prefer to call it controlled creativity. Controlled creativity? Lila repeated, laughing. That's adorable. Hank rolled his eyes, but he was smiling. He couldn't remember the last time planning something felt this easy. Lila had a way of turning stress into excitement, like flipping a switch. When the final bell rang, Hank gathered his papers while Lila packed up her tote. She paused at the door, scarf trailing behind her like a ribbon. Tomorrow, she said, pointing at him with a marker. Staff meeting. Be ready to wow them. I'll try, Hank replied. No trying, she said with a wink. Just math magic. As she disappeared down the hall, Hank stared at the empty doorway, feeling that odd flip in his stomach again. He told himself it was just nerves about the festival. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The staff meeting was scheduled for 3:30 in the library. Hank arrived early, laptop in hand, ready to present his carefully crafted slides. He'd spent half the night polishing them, charts, bullet points, even a projected revenue estimate. Professional, organized, exactly what the board would expect. Then Lila walked in with a rainbow-colored poster and a grin that could power a small city. "Ta-da!" she announced, holding up the poster like a trophy. It was covered in doodles, balloons, confetti, a smiling pencil, with jazz hands, of course. Across the top, in glittery letters, it read, "Festival fun for everyone." Hank stared. "That's a very bright." "Thank you," Lila said, beaming. "I was going for eye-catching." "It's definitely catching something," Hank muttered, earning a playful elbow in the ribs. As the other teachers filed in, Hank launched into his presentation. He explained the concept, the educational benefits, the potential revenue. Heads nodded, murmurs of approval rippled through the room. Then Lila jumped in, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. "And imagine the kids' faces when they walk into a hallway full of games and color. We're talking balloon arches, music, maybe even a mascot. This isn't just a fundraiser. It's an experience." By the time she finished, the room was buzzing with excitement. Teachers volunteered for booths, ideas flew like confetti. Hank watched it all unfold, equal parts relieved and impressed. When the meeting ended, Lila turned to him with a triumphant smile. "Told you." Whoosh. Hank laughed. "You were right. Get used to saying that," she teased, slinging her tote over her shoulder. "It's going to happen a lot." As Hank packed up his laptop, he realized something. This festival wasn't just going to work, it was going to be incredible. And maybe, just maybe, so was the woman who had turned his practical little idea into something magical. Chapter 4. Community Connections. Saturday morning found Hank Carlson standing in front of Willow Creek's main entrance with a clipboard in one hand and a knot of nerves in his stomach. Today was the big push, visiting local businesses to secure sponsorships for the festival. He'd made a neat list: hardware store, bakery, garden center, and the quirky little art supply shop downtown. Simple enough, right? Then Lila Bennett pulled into the parking lot in a car that looked like it had been attacked by a rainbow. Stickers covered the bumper, and the back seat was a chaos of paint tubes and canvas rolls. She hopped out wearing a bright yellow coat and sunglasses shaped like hearts. "Ready to charm the town?" she called, striding toward him with the confidence of someone about to win a game show. Hank held up his clipboard like a shield. "I was ready until you showed up looking like a walking art exhibit." "Thank you," Lila said, grinning. "I aim to inspire." Hank shook his head, amused despite himself. "We're asking for donations, not starting a parade." "Same skill set," she said breezily. "Smile. Make people feel good. Leave them wanting more." He chuckled. "You make it sound easy." "It is easy," Lila said, looping her arm through his and steering him toward his truck. "Come on, Mr. Math Magic. Let's go make some deals." The hardware store smelled like sawdust and ambition. Hank approached the counter with his best professional smile, while Lila wandered off to admire paint swatches like they were fine art. "Morning," Hank said to the clerk, a burly man named Doug who looked like he could bench press a toolbox. I'm Hank Carlson from Willow Creek Elementary. We're hosting a school festival and hoping local businesses might sponsor a booth or donate supplies. Doug scratched his beard. What kind of supplies? Wood for game structures, maybe some nails, paint. Paint! Lila popped up beside Hank, waving a swatch like a victory flag. Imagine a ring toss with bright, cheerful colors. Your paint could make that happen. Doug blinked at her enthusiasm, then chuckled. You're a lively one. She's the art teacher, Hank explained, trying not to smile too much. Well, Doug said, leaning on the counter, I like supporting the school. I'll throw in some paint and a couple of boards. Thank you, Hank said, relief washing over him. And, Lila added, eyes sparkling, we'll put your logo on the festival banner. Free advertising. Doug grinned. Deal. As they left, Hank shook his head. You're dangerous. I prefer effective, Lila said, sliding into the passenger seat. Next stop. The bakery was warm and fragrant, the air thick with sugar and cinnamon. Hank barely had time to introduce himself before Lila launched into a pitch that sounded more like a love letter to pastries. Your cupcakes are legendary, she told the owner, a petite woman named Marjorie. Imagine a cupcake walk at the festival. Kids laughing, frosting everywhere. Pure joy. Marjorie laughed, clearly charmed. I suppose I could donate a few dozen. A few dozen? Lila gasped theatrically. You'd be the hero of the day. By the time they left, Hank was carrying a promise for 50 cupcakes and a coupon for free coffee. He glanced at Lila as they walked to the truck. You're really good at this, she shrugged, smiling. People like feeling part of something fun. You just have to paint the picture. Hank thought about that as he started the engine. Maybe that was what made Lila so magnetic. She didn't just see the world as it was. She saw what it could be, and she made you believe in it too. The garden center was Hank's personal heaven. Rows of flowers, the earthy scent of soil, sunlight filtering through glass. He felt himself relax as they wandered past potted herbs. This place is gorgeous, Lila said, trailing her fingers over a row of lavender. You probably know every plant by name. Most of them, Hank admitted. I grow herbs at home. Of course you do, Lila said with a grin. You're like a walking Pinterest board. Hank laughed. That's a new one. They found the manager near the seed racks, and Hank launched into his pitch. Before he could finish, Lila jumped in with an idea that made Hank blink. What if we have a plant-a-seed booth? She suggested. Kids get a little pot, some soil, a seed to take home. It's educational and adorable. The manager loved it. 10 minutes later, they had a donation of seeds and soil, plus a promise of discounted pots. As they walked back to the truck, Lila bumped Hank's shoulder. See? We're unstoppable. Hank smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Yeah, we are. Their last stop was the art supply shop, a quirky little place crammed with canvases and brushes. Lila was in her element, darting from aisle to aisle like a kid in a candy store. Hank, meanwhile, managed to knock over an entire display of garden gnomes. The crash was spectacular. Ceramic shattered, pieces skittering across the floor. Hank froze, horrified. Oh no, he muttered. Oh no, oh no. Lila appeared, eyes wide, then burst out laughing. Hank, you just committed gunnomicide. It was an accident, Hank said, crouching to gather shards. I barely touched it. Sure, Lila teased, kneeling to help. You're secretly a gnome hater. By the time the clerk arrived, Hank was red-faced and apologetic. He paid for 2 broken gnomes, and Lila couldn't stop giggling all the way to the truck. I'm never living this down, am I? Hank groaned. Not a chance, Lila said, grinning. But hey, at least you made today memorable. Hank laughed, shaking his head. Your trouble. And you love it? She said lightly, buckling her seatbelt. Hank didn't answer. But as he drove back toward the school, he realized she wasn't wrong. That night, Hank sat at his kitchen table, tallying donations and sketching booth layouts. The numbers looked good, better than he'd hoped. But his mind kept drifting to Lila's laughter, bright and unrestrained, echoing in his ears. He told himself it was just gratitude, just relief that the festival was coming together. But deep down, he knew it was something else, something he wasn't ready to name. Chapter 5. Rumors and Realizations. By Monday morning, the festival buzz had officially taken over Willow Creek Elementary. Hank could feel it in the hallways, teachers chatting about booth ideas, students whispering excitedly about prizes. Even the janitor had asked if he could run a beanbag toss. Hank should have been thrilled. Instead, he was trying very hard not to blush, because apparently the buzz wasn't just about the festival anymore. It started innocently enough. Hank was walking toward his classroom when Mrs. Parker, the third-grade teacher, gave him a sly smile. Big weekend, huh? She said. Hank blinked. Sure. Running around town with Lila Bennett, she added, her tone dripping with implication. Hank nearly tripped over his own feet. We were getting donations for the festival. Of course you were, Mrs. Parker said, winking before disappearing into her classroom. Hank stood frozen in the hallway, heat creeping up his neck. Surely that was just Mrs. Parker being Mrs. Parker, right? Wrong. By lunchtime, two more teachers had made comments. One about the dynamic duo, another about art and math making sparks. Hank wanted to crawl under a table. When he finally escaped to the greenhouse for a breather, Lila was already there, perched on a stool with a sketchpad balanced on her knees. She looked up as he entered, her smile bright and easy. "Hey partner," she said. "Check this out." She turned the sketchpad toward him. It was a rough design for the festival layout, color-coded booths, balloon arches, even a doodle of a smiling pencil mascot. Hank couldn't help but grin. "This is great," he said, taking the sketch. "You've thought of everything." "Of course," Lila said, hopping off the stool. "I'm a visionary." Hank chuckled, setting the sketchpad down. "Apparently, we're also the subject of school gossip." Lila raised an eyebrow. "Oh, Mrs. Parker called us the dynamic duo." Lila laughed, tossing her scarf over her shoulder like a cape. "I'll take it. Sounds heroic." Hank shook his head, smiling despite himself. "I just don't want people getting the wrong idea." "Wrong idea?" Lila teased, stepping closer. "Like what? That we're having fun." Hank opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because yes, they were having fun. And maybe that was the problem. Fun was easy. Feelings were complicated. Before he could respond, a group of students burst into the greenhouse, chattering about the festival. Lila turned to greet them, her laughter ringing out like sunlight. Hank watched her, something warm and unsettling blooming in his chest. He told himself it was just admiration, just appreciation for her creativity and energy. But deep down, he knew it was more. Later that week, the rumors didn't die down. If anything, they grew louder. Hank overheard snippets in the hallway. "Did you see them in the parking lot? They make such a cute team." Even Principal Harris gave him a knowing smile during a staff meeting. Hank tried to ignore it, focusing on logistics, ticket printing, booth assignments, prize inventory. But every time Lila breezed into his classroom with her bright scarves and bigger-than-life ideas, his resolve wavered. One afternoon, as they finalized the booth list, Lila leaned over his desk, her hair brushing his shoulder. Hank froze, his brain short-circuiting at the proximity. "Okay," she said, tapping the paper. "We've got ring toss, cupcake walk, math maze, plant a seed. What about an art station? Quick sketches, face painting." "Face painting," Hank repeated, his voice a little too high. "Kids love it," Lila said, grinning. "And I'm a pro. I once turned a kindergartner into a full-on tiger in under 5 minutes." Hank laughed, the tension easing. "You're unstoppable." "Don't forget it," she said, winking. And just like that, Hank was back to square one, heart racing, thoughts tangled, wondering when exactly his life had turned into a romantic comedy. That night, Hank sat at his kitchen table, staring at the festival spreadsheet. Everything was coming together beautifully. The numbers added up, the booths were assigned, the donations were rolling in. So why couldn't he stop thinking about Lila Bennett? Her laugh, her energy, the way she made planning feel like an adventure instead of a chore. Hank rubbed his temples, muttering to himself, "Get it together, Carlson. This is about the kids, the festival, not whatever this is." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away. Chapter 6. The Greenhouse Moment. The greenhouse had always been Hank's sanctuary, a quiet place where the world slowed down, where numbers and deadlines faded beneath the soft rustle of leaves. Tonight, it was more than that. It was a refuge from the whirlwind of festival planning, from spreadsheets and ticket counts, and if he was honest, from the confusing tangle of feelings he'd been carrying around like extra weight. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar warmth and earthy scent. Rows of basil and mint stretched toward the glass ceiling, their green leaves glowing under the soft hum of grow lights. Hank exhaled, tension easing from his shoulders. Then he heard the voice. "Wow," Lila said, emerging from behind a row of tomato plants like a character in a fairy tale. "This place is incredible." Hank nearly dropped the watering can. "Lila, what are you doing here?" She grinned, scarf trailing behind her like a comet. "I saw your truck outside. Figured you were hiding in your secret garden." "It's not a secret," Hank said, though his voice sounded flustered even to his own ears. "I just needed a break." "Me too," Lila admitted, wandering deeper into the greenery. "The art room looks like a glitter bomb went off. I swear, if I inhale one more speck of gold dust, I'll sparkle permanently." Hank chuckled, setting the watering can down. "Could be worse." "True," she said, brushing her fingers over a basil leaf. "You could be drowning in ticket math." "I am drowning in ticket math," Hank said dryly. Lila laughed, the sound bright and easy. Then she turned, her expression softening as she took in the rows of plants. "You really love this, don't you?" Hank hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, it's grounding. When everything feels chaotic, this makes sense." Lila stepped closer, her voice gentle. "I get that. For me, it's painting. When the world feels loud, I just make something." Hank looked at her, surprised by the quiet vulnerability in her tone. For a moment, the playful energy that always surrounded her dimmed, revealing something deeper, something that tugged at him in ways he didn't expect. "You're good at making things," he said softly. "Not just art. This festival, it wouldn't be happening without you." Lila smiled, but it wasn't her usual dazzling grin. It was smaller, warmer, like sunlight slipping through clouds. "You're not so bad yourself, Mr. Math Magic." Hank laughed, but his heart wasn't in the joke. Because suddenly, the space between them felt charged, like the air before a summer storm. Lila was close enough that he could see the faint smudge of paint on her wrist, smell the hint of vanilla from her shampoo. His pulse thudded in his ears. Say something, he told himself. Anything. But before he could, Lila tilted her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know, Hank, I think we make a pretty great team." He swallowed hard. "Yeah, we do." Her eyes held his, bright and searching. For one dizzying second, Hank thought knew she was going to kiss him. His breath caught, his heart leaping like a startled bird. And then, "Mr. Carlson," a voice shrieked from the doorway. Hank jerked back like he'd been electrocuted. A fifth grader stood in the entrance, clutching a crumpled permission slip. "My mom said I need you to sign this," the kid announced, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. Lila stepped away, scarf fluttering as she turned toward the interruption. Hank forced a smile, though his pulse was still racing. "Sure," he said, taking the paper with hands that felt oddly clumsy. "I'll take care of it." The student bolted as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving silence in their wake. Hank stared at the door, then at Lila, who was biting her lip to keep from laughing. "Well," she said lightly, "that was dramatic." Hank managed to chuckle, though his voice sounded strained. "Perfect timing." "Always," Lila said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Then she grabbed her bag and headed for the door. "See you tomorrow, partner." Hank watched her go, his heart still pounding, his thoughts a tangled mess of what-ifs. When the greenhouse fell silent again, he sank onto the stool Lila had vacated, running a hand through his hair. He'd almost kissed her. Almost. And the worst part? He wanted to try again. That night, Hank lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. The way her voice softened, the way her eyes held his, the way the world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them, standing among rows of basil and possibility. He told himself it was nothing, just a near miss, just a flicker of something that didn't mean anything. But deep down, he knew better. It meant everything. Chapter 7. Festival Frenzy. The morning of the festival dawned bright and deceptively calm, like the eye of a storm. Hank Carlson stood in the school parking lot, clipboard in hand, heart thudding like a drum. Volunteers bustled around him, hauling boxes of prizes, stringing up balloons, and arguing over whether the ticket booth should face east or west. "This is fine," Hank muttered under his breath. Everything is fine. It was not fine. The first sign of trouble came at 8:15, when Mrs. Parker rushed up, her face pale. "Hank, the tickets. There's a problem." Hank's stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" "They're missing," she whispered dramatically. "All 500. Hank blinked. "Missing? How do 500 tickets just vanish?" Mrs. Parker threw up her hands. "Ask the universe." Before Hank could respond, Lila appeared like a whirlwind, scarf fluttering, arms full of streamers. "What's going on?" "Tickets," Hank said grimly. "Gone." Lila frowned, then grinned. "No problem. We'll make more." "Make more," Hank echoed. "We don't have time." "Sure we do," Lila said, already pulling paper from a supply box. "Grab scissors. Let's go." 10 minutes later, Hank found himself hunched over a table in the art room, cutting strips of colored paper while Lila scribbled numbers in bold marker. Around them, volunteers joined in, turning the emergency into an assembly line. "This is ridiculous," Hank muttered, snipping furiously. "We're improvising tickets like a bootleg carnival." "Improvisation is the soul of creativity," Lila said, flashing him a grin. "Besides, these are way prettier than the originals." Hank glanced at the pile of rainbow-colored tickets and had to admit, they were cheerful. Chaotic, but cheerful. By the time the doors opened at 10 o'clock, the crisis was contained. Families streamed in, laughter echoing through the halls. Hank exhaled, relief washing over him. Then the popcorn machine exploded. It happened at the snack booth, where a volunteer had apparently ignored the "do not overfill" warning. One moment, the machine was humming happily. The next, it was spewing popcorn like a geyser. Hank arrived just in time to see kernels raining down like confetti. Lila was in the middle of it, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. "Grab a bucket," she shouted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We're under attack." Hank grabbed a trash bin and held it under the machine, trying to stem the flow. Popcorn bounced off his shoulders, stuck in his hair, filled his shoes. By the time they wrestled the machine into submission, Hank looked like a walking snack. Lila grinned at him, brushing a kernel off his shirt. "You wear chaos well." Hank groaned. "I'm never eating popcorn again." "Don't make promises you can't keep," she teased. eyes sparkling. Just when Hank thought things couldn't get any wilder, a scream echoed from the hallway. The goat is loose. Hank froze. The what? The petting zoo goat, a student yelled, sprinting past. It escaped. Hank dropped his clipboard and bolted, Lila hot on his heels. They rounded a corner and found the goat trotting down the hall like it owned the place, a trail of hay behind it. Oh no, Hank muttered. Oh no, no, no. Relax, Lila said, grinning. I've got this. Before Hank could ask what that meant, Lila crouched low, arms out like a rodeo star. Here, buddy, she cooed. Come to Auntie Lila. The goat stared at her, unimpressed. Then it bolted. Not helpful, Hank shouted, sprinting after it. What followed was pure chaos. Hank and Lila chasing the goat through the gym, past the cupcake walk, and into the math maze. At one point, Hank tripped over a beanbag, and Lila nearly collided with a balloon arch. By the time they cornered the goat near the greenhouse, both were breathless and laughing so hard they could barely stand. Gotcha, Lila crowed, looping a rope around the goat's neck like a victorious cowboy. Hank leaned against the wall, panting. I'm never doing this again. Yes, you are, Lila said, grinning as she led the goat back to its pen. You love it. Hank didn't argue, because deep down she was right. By late afternoon, the chaos had settled into something magical. The halls buzzed with laughter, booths overflowed with happy kids, and the ticket jar was stuffed with cash. Hank stood near the entrance, watching families play games, his heart swelling with pride. We did it, Lila said, appearing at his side. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair a little wild, and there was a streak of paint on her wrist. She looked radiant. Yeah, Hank said softly. We did. For a moment, they just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, soaking it in. Then Lila turned, her eyes bright. Dance with me later, she said. Hank blinked. Dance? At the community party, she said, smiling. Don't tell me you're afraid of a little music. Hank swallowed, his pulse kicking up. I'll think about it. Don't think, Lila said, winking. Just say yes. And then she was gone, swept into the crowd like a burst of color, leaving Hank standing there with his heart pounding and a thought he couldn't shake. He didn't want to think anymore. He wanted to say yes. Chapter 8. The Dance. By the time the last booth closed and the final balloon sagged toward the floor, Willow Creek Elementary looked like a battlefield of joy. Confetti scattered across the halls, sticky fingerprints on every surface, and the faint smell of popcorn lingering like a stubborn guest. Hank Carlson stood near the ticket table, tallying the numbers with a grin he couldn't suppress. They'd done it. The festival had been a roaring success. Families laughed, kids played, teachers bonded, and the donation jar overflowed with cash. Enough to fund after-school programs for months, maybe even a year. He should have been exhausted. He was exhausted. But when Lila Bennett appeared in the doorway of the gym, scarf trailing like a comet, something in Hank's chest jolted awake. Come on, she called, her voice carrying over the hum of chatter. The dance is starting. Hank blinked. Dance? The community party? Lila said, striding toward him with that unstoppable energy. Music, lights, awkward swaying. Don't tell me you're backing out now. Hank hesitated, glancing at his clipboard like it might save him. I'm not much of a dancer. Perfect, Lila said, grabbing his hand before he could protest. Neither am I. And just like that, Hank was being pulled into the gym, his heart thudding like a drumline. The transformation was stunning. Hours ago, the gym had been a chaos of booths and beanbags. Now, it shimmered under strings of fairy lights. The floor cleared for dancing. A local band played upbeat tunes near the stage, and families swayed in clusters, laughter mingling with music. Hank swallowed hard as Lila led him to the edge of the dance floor. I really don't. Relax, she said, smiling up at him. It's not a competition. Easy for you to say, Hank muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Because Lila was close, closer than she'd ever been, and suddenly, the idea of dancing didn't seem terrifying at all. The music shifted to a slower tempo, a soft melody that curled through the air like smoke. Lila tilted her head, eyes sparkling. Guess we're doing this. Before Hank could respond, she slid her arms around his neck, light and effortless. His hands found her waist almost without permission, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. They moved slowly, awkward at first, then easier as the rhythm settled into their bones. Hank wasn't graceful. He knew that, but Lila didn't seem to care. She hummed along to the music, her scarf brushing his arm, her laughter warm against his chest. You're not bad, she teased. I'm counting in my head, Hank admitted. Of course you are, Lila said, grinning. Math brain. Hank chuckled, his pulse thrumming. You make it look easy. That's because I'm not thinking, she said softly. You should try it. Hank swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Because thinking was all he'd been doing, about her laugh, her energy, the way she made everything brighter. And now, with her in his arms, thinking felt impossible. Lila, he began, his voice low. She looked up, eyes luminous under the fairy lights. Yeah. Hank opened his mouth, the words hovering on the edge. I like you. More than I should. More than I planned. But before he could speak, Mr. Carlson, a voice bellowed from across the gym. Hank flinched, turning to see Principal Harris striding toward them, his expression urgent. We need you at the ticket table. There's a discrepancy. Hank blinked. A what? Discrepancy? Harris repeated, waving a clipboard like a sword. Come on. Hank looked at Lila, frustration knotting in his chest. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Go, she said lightly. Duty calls. Hank hesitated, then nodded, stepping back as the music swelled. I'll be right back. Sure, Lila said, her voice soft, and then she was gone, swallowed by the crowd, her scarf trailing like a ribbon of color. By the time Hank sorted out the ticket issue, a simple miscount, nothing catastrophic, the dance was winding down. The band packed up, families drifted toward the doors, and the fairy lights dimmed one by one. Lila was nowhere in sight. Hank stood in the emptying gym, his heart heavy with words unsaid. He'd had his chance. He'd almost taken it. Almost. And now he wasn't sure when, or if he'd get another. That night, Hank drove home under a sky scattered with stars, the echo of music still humming in his ears. He told himself it was fine. There would be other moments, other chances. But deep down, he knew the truth. He didn't want another moment. He wanted that one back. Chapter 9. Misunderstandings. The Monday after the festival should have felt like victory. Hank Carlson walked into Willow Creek Elementary with a bounce in his step, the donation total still glowing in his mind like a neon sign. $4,872. Enough to fund after-school programs, art supplies, maybe even a small scholarship fund. He'd done it. They'd done it. But the moment he stepped into the teacher's lounge, the bounce vanished. Lila was there, perched on the edge of the counter, chatting with Mrs. Parker. Her scarf was a swirl of crimson today, her laughter bright as ever. Hank's heart gave its usual traitorous lurch, then froze as he caught a snippet of her words. So if I get in, I'll have to move by summer, Lila was saying, her voice casual, almost breezy. It's a huge opportunity, Mrs. Parker gasped. An art program? Out of state. Chicago, Lila confirmed, grinning. Full scholarship. It's competitive, but fingers crossed. Hank stood rooted to the spot, the world tilting like a carnival ride gone rogue. Move? Summer? Chicago? He felt the words slam into him like a math problem he couldn't solve. Mrs. Parker clapped her hands. That's amazing, Lila. You'd be brilliant there. I hope so, Lila said, her smile softening. It's everything I've wanted. Hank's throat tightened. Everything she'd wanted, which apparently didn't include him. Whatever fragile, unspoken thing had been blooming between them. He backed out of the lounge before they noticed him, his pulse pounding in his ears. By the time he reached his classroom, the bounce in his step had turned to lead. Hank spent the morning teaching fractions, his voice steady, his smile practiced. But inside, his thoughts churned like a storm. She's leaving. She's chasing her dream. And you what? You thought a few laughs and a dance meant something? Get real, Carlson. He hated how bitter the thought sounded. Hated how small it made him feel. Lila deserved this opportunity. Of course she did. She was talented, passionate, unstoppable. Chicago would be lucky to have her. So why did it feel like someone had yanked the floor out from under him? After lunch, Hank headed to the greenhouse, hoping the quiet would calm him. He was misting the basil when the door creaked open. Hey, partner, Lila said, stepping inside with that familiar burst of color. Hiding again? Hank forced a smile. Just watering. Good, she said, wandering between the rows. These plants look happier than half the staff. Hank chuckled weakly, focusing on the spray nozzle. He could feel her eyes on him, bright and curious. You okay? She asked after a moment. You seem quiet. I'm fine, Hank said quickly. Too quickly. Lila tilted her head. Fine, huh? That's convincing. Hank swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the watering can. He wanted to ask, wanted to say, Chicago? Summer? Is it true? But the words stuck like gum on pavement. Instead, he muttered, just tired. Lila smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Well, you earned it. The festival was amazing. Yeah, Hank said softly. It was. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and awkward. Then Lila glanced at her watch. Gotta run, she said lightly. Art club waits for no one. Hank nodded, watching her scarf trail behind her as she left. When the door clicked shut, he sank onto the stool, staring at the basil like it held answers. She was leaving, and he couldn't decide what hurt more, the thought of losing her, or the fact that he'd never told her how he felt. Hank sat at his kitchen table, staring at a blank page in his notebook. He'd opened it to sketch ideas for next year's festival, but all he could think about was Lila's voice. If I get in, I'll have to move by summer. He imagined Chicago, tall buildings, bustling streets, art galleries humming with possibility. He imagined Lila there, scarf fluttering, laughter echoing in a world far from Willow Creek. And he imagined himself here, in his quiet house, tending basil and teaching math, pretending he wasn't missing something vital. Hank closed the notebook, his chest aching with words unsaid. Chapter 10. The grand gesture. Hank Carlson had never been one for dramatic moves. He was a math teacher, after all, steady, logical, predictable. But as he stood in the greenhouse late Thursday evening, surrounded by rows of basil and mint, he realized logic wasn't going to fix this. Lila was leaving. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And if he didn't do something, say something, he'd lose his chance. The thought gnawed at him like a stubborn equation he couldn't solve. So Hank decided to do what he did best, create something that made sense, and maybe, just maybe, made magic too. It started with a sketch, a rough design on the back of a lesson plan. A greenhouse exhibit that blended math and art, two worlds colliding in color and symmetry. He pictured geometric patterns painted on pots, Fibonacci spirals traced in chalk along the floor, strings of lights forming perfect angles overhead. Numbers and creativity, side by side, like they belonged together, like he and Lila did. Hank spent hours gathering supplies, paint, brushes, fairy lights, even a roll of butcher paper for a mural. He worked after school, long after the halls emptied, his hands stained with color, his heart pounding with something that felt suspiciously like hope. By Friday evening, the greenhouse had transformed. Rows of plants framed a walkway lined with painted pots, each adorned with vibrant patterns and tiny math equations. Lights twinkled overhead in precise intervals, forming triangles and arcs. At the center stood a mural, a swirling design of numbers and brushstrokes, math meeting art in a dance of color. Hank stepped back, breathless. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't professional. But it was his heart on display, every line and curve whispering what he couldn't say out loud. He texted Lila before he could lose his nerve. Greenhouse, after school. I have something to show you. Her reply came fast. Sounds mysterious. I'm intrigued. Hank stared at the screen, his pulse thudding. This was it. No turning back. The greenhouse door creaked open at 4:15, and Lila stepped inside, scarf trailing like a ribbon of fire. She froze, her eyes widening as she took in the transformation. Hank! Her voice was a whisper, soft and stunned. What is this? Hank swallowed hard, his throat dry. It's a math and art. Together. I wanted to show you that they're not opposites. They're connected. Like us. Lila turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over the painted pots, the glowing lights, the mural blooming across the wall. When she looked back at him, her eyes shimmered. You did all this? She asked. Hank nodded, his heart hammering. I know you're thinking about leaving, and I get it, you should chase your dream. But before you go, I needed you to know. He paused, the words catching like thorns. You matter to me, Lila. More than I planned. More than I can explain. Silence stretched, heavy and fragile. Then Lila stepped closer, her scarf brushing his arm, her smile trembling at the edges. Hank, she said softly, I'm not leaving yet, and even if I do, you matter to me too. His breath caught. You do. She nodded, her eyes bright. You've made this place feel like home. You've made me laugh when I wanted to scream. And this, she gestured to the mural, the lights, the math spirals glowing under the glass. This is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever done for me. Hank's chest ached with relief, with joy, with something so big it scared him. So what now? Lila smiled, stepping close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. Now, she whispered. You stop overthinking. And then, finally, blessedly, she kissed him. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't a movie scene with swelling music. It was better, soft and real, tasting faintly of vanilla and hope. Hank's hands found her waist. Her fingers curled into his shirt, and for a moment, the world outside the greenhouse ceased to exist. When they broke apart, breathless and grinning, Lila rested her forehead against his. You know, she murmured. For a math guy, you're pretty good at grand gestures. Hank laughed, his heart soaring. Don't get used to it. Too late, Lila said, smiling like sunlight. I already have. That night, Hank walked home under a sky scattered with stars, his pulse still humming with possibility. Lila might leave someday, or maybe she wouldn't, but for now she was here, and so was he. And for the first time in weeks, Hank felt like the equation balanced perfectly. Chapter 11. Confession and Comedy. Hank Carlson woke up Friday morning feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The memory of last night, the greenhouse glowing under fairy lights, Lila's smile, her kiss, played on a loop in his mind like his favorite song. For once, the numbers in his head weren't fractions or ticket counts. They were moments, bright and infinite. But as he walked into school, reality tapped him on the shoulder. Because while the kiss had been perfect, the conversation hadn't gone far enough. He'd told her she mattered. She'd said the same. But the question still lingered like an unsolved equation. Was she leaving? Hank knew he couldn't avoid it. Not if he wanted clarity. Not if he wanted more. He found Lila in the art room after last period, perched on a stool with a paintbrush in one hand and a smear of cobalt blue on her cheek. She looked up as he entered, her smile blooming like sunlight. Hey partner, she said. Here to critique my masterpiece? Hank chuckled, stepping closer. I wouldn't dare. Good, Lila said, dipping her brush into a jar of water. Because this dragon is fierce. Hank glanced at the mural taking shape on the wall. A swirl of color and scales, bold and unapologetic. It was pure Lila, vibrant, alive. He cleared his throat. Can we talk? Lila froze, then set the brush down slowly. That sounds serious. It's important, Hank said, his voice low. She tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Okay, shoot. Hank took a breath, steadying himself like he was about to step onto a tightrope. I overheard you in the lounge, talking about Chicago. Lila blinked, then laughed softly. Ah, so that's what's been eating you. Hank frowned. Eating me? You've been walking around like someone stole your calculator. She teased gently. Then her smile softened. Yes, I applied to an art program. Yes, it's competitive. And yes, if I get in, I'll have to move. Hank's chest tightened. So, you're leaving? Not yet, Lila said, her voice calm. And maybe not at all. It's a dream, Hank. One I've had for years. But that doesn't mean I'm running away tomorrow. Hank swallowed hard. I didn't want to lose you without saying. He stopped, the words tangling like vines. Without saying how much you mean to me. Lila stepped closer, her eyes bright and steady. You already said it. Last night. Not enough, Hank murmured. You matter to me, Lila. More than I planned. More than I thought possible. Silence stretched, warm and fragile. Then Lila smiled. A smile that could melt glaciers. You matter to me too, Hank. Chicago or no Chicago. Relief crashed over him like a wave, leaving him breathless. So what now? Before Lila could answer, the door burst open and a fifth grader barreled in, clutching a paint-smeared permission slip. Ms. Bennett, my mom says you need to sign this or I can't be a dragon in the play. Lila laughed, taking the paper. Give me 2 seconds, kiddo. The student hovered, eyeing Hank with unabashed curiosity. Are you two dating? Hank choked. Lila grinned. Not yet, she said cheerfully, signing the slip. But we're working on it. The kid's eyes widened. Cool. And then they were gone, leaving Hank red-faced and Lila laughing so hard she had to lean against the wall. Oh my God, she wheezed. Your face, priceless. Hank groaned. I'm never living that down. Probably not, Lila said, wiping tears of laughter. But hey, at least it's official now. Hank stared at her, his heart thudding. Official? She stepped close, her voice dropping to a whisper. If you want it to be. Hank didn't hesitate. I do. And then he kissed her again. This time without interruptions, without hesitation, without fear. When they finally broke apart, breathless and grinning, Lila rested her forehead against his. You know, she murmured. For a math guy, you're getting really good at solving problems. Hank laughed, his chest light. Best equation I've ever worked on. That night, Hank walked home under a sky streaked with pink and gold, his heart humming with certainty. Lila might leave someday, or maybe she wouldn't, but for now she was here, and so was he. And for the first time in his life, Hank Carlson didn't need numbers to know the answer. Chapter 12. A new beginning. The Monday after the festival felt different, lighter, brighter, like the whole school was humming with possibility. Hank Carlson walked into Willow Creek Elementary with a spring in his step, clutching a folder of final numbers for Principal Harris. The festival had raised nearly $5,000, and the feedback from parents was glowing. If this didn't convince the board, nothing would. He found Harris in the office, reviewing paperwork with his usual calm efficiency. Hank handed over the folder, his pulse ticking like a metronome. Impressive, Harris said after a glance. Very impressive. Hank tried not to grin too hard. So, do you think? I don't think, Harris interrupted, his mouth curving into a rare smile. I know. The board approved it this morning. The festival is now an annual event. Hank exhaled, relief flooding his chest. That's incredible. You did good work, Carlson, Harris said, standing to shake his hand. And from what I hear, you had quite the team. Hank's grin widened. Yeah, I did. Word spread fast. By lunchtime, the halls buzzed with excitement. Teachers congratulated Hank, students high-fived him, and someone even taped a paper crown to his chair with the words Festival King scrawled in glitter. Hank laughed, shaking his head. I'm never living this down. You shouldn't want to, Lila said, appearing at his side like a burst of color. Her scarf was a swirl of emerald today, her smile bright enough to light the hallway. You earned it. So did you, Hank said, his voice warm. Couldn't have done it without you. True, Lila teased, looping her arm through his. But let's not tell anyone. I like watching you squirm under all this attention. Hank chuckled, his heart doing that familiar flip. Your trouble. And you love it, she said, winking. After school, Hank slipped away to the greenhouse, craving a moment of quiet before the next wave of congratulations. The air was warm and fragrant, sunlight slanting through the glass in golden beams. He was misting the basil when the door creaked open. Thought I'd find you here, Lila said, stepping inside with that effortless grace that made Hank's pulse stutter. Your secret garden. It's not a secret, Hank said, smiling. Just peaceful. Peaceful is overrated, Lila said, wandering between the rows. But this, she gestured to the plants, the twinkling lights still strung from his grand gesture. This is magic. Hank set down the watering can, his throat tightening. About the other night. Lila turned, her eyes bright. What about it? I meant what I said, Hank murmured. You matter to me, and I don't want to waste time pretending I don't feel that way. Lila smiled, soft and radiant. Good, because I don't want to pretend either. Hank's breath caught. So, we're really doing this? Looks like it, Lila said, stepping closer until her scarf brushed his arm. Unless you've got a math equation that says otherwise. Hank laughed, his chest light. No equations, just this. And then he kissed her, slow and sure, with the scent of basil and sunlight wrapping around them like a promise. It was better than the first kiss, better than he'd imagined, because this time there was no hesitation, no interruptions, no what-ifs, just Hank and Lila, standing in a greenhouse that felt like the start of something extraordinary. When they finally broke apart, breathless and grinning, Lila rested her forehead against his. You know, she murmured, I think we make a pretty great team. Hank smiled, his heart soaring. The best. Outside, the world went on. Kids laughing, buses rumbling, life moving forward. But inside the greenhouse, time felt suspended, like a perfect equation balanced at last. And for Hank Carlson, that was all he needed. Chapter 13. Epilogue, Equations and Brushstrokes. Spring arrived in Willow Creek like a watercolor painting. Soft greens bleeding into blues, blossoms dotting the trees like confetti. Hank Carlson stood in the greenhouse, sunlight pooling across the floor, and smiled at the sight before him. The mural was still there, vibrant and alive, a swirl of numbers and color that had become the heart of the space. But now, new additions framed it. Rows of pots painted by students, each bearing a tiny equation and a splash of creativity. Math and art, side by side, just like he'd imagined. Just like them. Hank. Lila's voice floated through the open door, bright and familiar. She appeared moments later, scarf trailing behind her like a ribbon of spring. In her hands, she carried a stack of sketchbooks and a bouquet of wildflowers, because of course she did. You're early, Hank said, grinning as she set the flowers on the potting bench. I bribed the art club with extra glitter, Lila said, brushing a stray curl from her face. They practically shoved me out the door. Hank chuckled, reaching for the watering can. You're a menace. And you love it, she said, looping her arms around his waist from behind. Her chin rested on his shoulder, warm and easy. So, what's the plan for today, Mr. Festival King? Hank smiled at the nickname, one that had stuck far longer than he'd expected. We're prepping for next year's festival. The board wants bigger, better, more community involvement. Perfect, Lila said, spinning him around to face her. Because I have ideas. Of course you do, Hank said, laughing. Do any of them involve goats? Maybe, Lila teased, her eyes sparkling. But only if you promise not to chase them through the math maze again. Hank groaned. I'm never living that down. Not a chance, Lila said, grinning. It's my favorite memory. The festival had become an annual tradition, just as Hank had hoped. But it was more than that now, it was theirs. Every booth carried a piece of their partnership. Math games with artistic flair, art stations with hidden equations. Students loved it. Parents raved. And Hank felt like he'd found the perfect formula for happiness. Lila hadn't left for Chicago. She'd gotten in, of course she had, but she deferred the offer, choosing to stay in Willow Creek for now. Dreams don't expire, she told him one night, curled up on his couch with a mug of tea. But this, feels like something worth staying for. Hank had kissed her then, slow and certain, and whispered, You're my favorite variable. She'd laughed so hard she nearly spilled her tea. That's the nerdiest thing anyone's ever said to me. And yet, Hank had replied, grinning, You love it. Now, as sunlight streamed through the glass, Hank glanced at the bouquet Lila had brought and felt a thought bloom like the basil at his feet. Lila, he said slowly, what if we had the wedding here? Lila blinked, then broke into a smile so bright it made his chest ache. The greenhouse. Why not? Hank said, gesturing to the mural, the rows of plants, the fairy lights still strung from his grand gesture months ago. It's where it all started. Lila stepped closer, her fingers brushing his. Math and art, basil and wildflowers. Us. Exactly, Hank murmured. She grinned, looping her arms around his neck. You know, Carlson, for a guy who claims he's not dramatic, you're pretty good at sweeping gestures. Hank laughed, pulling her close. Don't get used to it. Too late, Lila whispered, kissing him softly. I already have. Later, as they stood together among rows of green, Hank realized something. Life wasn't about perfect formulas or flawless plans. It was about balance, numbers and colors, logic and chaos, math and art. And somehow, against all odds, he'd found his perfect solution. Lila Bennett, his favorite variable, his constant,